Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I bring to you the first half of my Q&A with Matt Schwartz, who's a former games producer for Adult Swim with Turner Broadcasting System. Matt and I spoke on August 31st, 2015. Just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this work that I'm doing, you can hop on over to NoDon'tDie.com to read more transcripts, and you'll also see a link there for my Patreon. Your support helps me continue doing work like this. Thanks for listening, and now, here's Matt Schwartz.
Games somehow have not really transcended the category of consumer product, which is how I think I thought of that when you mentioned, that the coverage is very, very product driven. The sort of cycle of preview, hype, pre-release.
Would you agree with that characterization, or?
I think for the most part it's true.
Yeah.
And the best analogy I can make is to the film business, which I love movies, but also I was involved in the film business. And what's interesting about games is that there is no level of critique that is akin to a David Denby or a Roger Ebert, R.I.P. But there's nobody out there, at least in the mainstream. There are niche publications, but nobody really talks about them, games that is, in the same manner that they talk about movies. Mm-hmm. And I think they are worthy of it, but it's never really gotten there, and that's more of a question mark for me. I'm not really sure why. I think maybe it's partially because the people who cover the games are sort of, tend to be younger, male, etc., all the things we know.
Really handsome.
Very handsome, charming, good at interviews.
Yes. Wait a minute.
But the other thing that this is the part that I've pondered on and off leading up to our discussion is that, in the thing about games that is so frustrating is that games tend to live in one genre bucket, which is for the most part, and this is a broad generalization, but if you were to look at sort of the kind of things that are promoted at, say, an E3, or just in general, if you look at game coverage of the games that get the most amount of attention, it's as if there is only one genre, and that genre is the action blockbuster. Now, it might be a sports game or it might be a driving game, but the point is that these are AAA, very action-driven, very high production value games, and the window, or I should say the bucket in which they fall, is a very narrow bucket. It seems to me. Now, there are indie games, and we can talk about those, and there are things that sometimes fall outside those typical genre buckets, and then there's Nintendo, who sort of marches to its own drum. But the point is that when you go to and by the way, it's getting diluted in movies too, but in general, you can go to the movie theater, a multiplex, and there will be an Avengers, and then there will also be a Meryl Streep drama or something that's perhaps to the left or right of center being the typical blockbuster. But you don't see that kind of diversity, and what's so frustrating to me is as a medium, there's so much potential there, and yet the industry is in a vicious cycle, which is a self-fulfilling well, no, it's not a prophecy, but it's definitely cyclical. It's the companies that make those games, the Activisions and EAs and so on, are expending an enormous amount of money. They're basically making Avengers constantly. And if you're only making Avengers, you're not going, and you're putting money at risk the way they are, and you have shareholders to, show value of your company and so on, are you going to, if the options boil down to A or B, A being doing what's worked before, or B, trying something different, inevitably you're going to pick A. You're going to do the thing that's worked. And because there's so much money on the line at this point in terms of production cost and teams and just pure development, there's even less experimentation than I think we've ever seen in the game industry. I think the cookie cutter sequels, even the new IPs are cookie cutter. I mean, I think I sent it to you when I watched the. Did you watch the Battleborn?
I did, yeah.
Which.
You said, so I mean, we can hop around. I haven't asked you to formally introduce yourself, but don't worry, I can fix that when we edit this. But,
okay.
I mean, you said, part of why you didn't feel the need to buy a current-gen console was the Battleborn Gamescom trailer. You said, despite the amazing artistry and technical wizardry on display, the whole thing has sort of become a parody of itself.
Yeah, I mean, the words, in your face, balls to the wall, gonna crush you. And it's, and you look at the character design, you look at the effects, you look at just the pure technical wizardry of it. Yeah. And you're like, this is amazing. And all it is just another fucking shooting gallery. And it's soul crushing. But I understand why they're making it. It's not a, I can't really fault, who are the Borderlands guys? I'm totally blanking on it now, but the developers.
They're out in Texas, right?
Yeah. Duke Nukem. Why am I blanking?
Is it Irrational?
No.
Is it Irrational?
They're gone. Irrational's gone.
I don't know anything about video games. Gearbox, sorry.
Gearbox, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a great deal of respect for those guys, and the work they do is amazing. But they have to make a cookie cutter shooter. They have to, because they've got to make good on their investments. And I'm sure these things are ballooning over $100 million. These games. I mean, with the current horsepower that the consoles have, they're pushing so many pixels. They have to.
I mean, do you feel like was there more creativity when the middle tier was still around?
Oh, for sure. Without a doubt.
I'm trying to remember, what sort of things do you remember there being that is just seemingly gone now?
The one that leaps to mind is Binary Domain, for some reason.
That was a weird shooter.
It was a weird Japanese shooter.
Wait, I think you have my copy.
Well, it's mine now.
Maybe it's yours now. That's fine. Yeah. But yeah, no.
But I played it thanks to you, and that's a perfect example though of the kind of game that in the current market is really hard to justify. I think because it's too expensive to not be something that's familiar. And yet it's too cheap to justify a $100 million marketing budget or something. People would bring that home and go, oh my God, this is janky and weird, and I don't want to play this. I want it to be, Destiny. I don't want, Terminator-like torsos crawling their way across the ground. There is always going to be the small percentage of the audience that will play a game like that and appreciate it for what it is, and that's why you'll get the the enthusiast press or whatever, or even the Nintendo fans that pushed for Xenoblade or whatever those sort of Japanese games. There is a very vocal minority that will appreciate those games, but that vocal minority doesn't translate. It doesn't scale, right? That doesn't make those games profitable. I would imagine that a game like Binary Domain probably broke even. Although I know it came out on PC, and once you can get on multiple platforms, you stand a better shot. But and they want to charge $60 just like Destiny wants to charge $60. And the bar just keeps getting raised. The feature list, the pure graphic fidelity of these things, and
yeah.
And so
I mean, oh, go ahead.
I don't know. It's just very disheartening because it's going to take somebody with a real vision and a real lack of risk aversion to come up with something that is purely original and say, I'm going to spend $200 million on my crawling torso game and fuck the rest of you, and really do something that's different and exciting. But the thing is, as we all know, people who create things, and I'm a creative person in addition to being a producer person, but as a creative person, I know that 9 out of 10 things don't work. I mean, you aren't necessarily going to hit it out of the park every time. I mean, that's how you end up with, Metal Gear Solid craziness from a guy who is... I'm not a huge Metal Gear Solid fan, but I know what the games are like, and they are definitely different and coming from the brain of this one guy. And, Konami's not making those anymore. I mean, this next one is supposedly the last of its kind, right? I mean, unless I have the facts wrong. They're kind of pulling out. Yeah.
Correct.
Right. They're kind of pulling out of that level of development.
And it's like
because
totally
they can't justify it.
Sex. Yeah, it's not at all for any sort of sexy reason. It's not feasible anymore.
Right.
But,
and that's kind of heartbreaking. Because even though I don't particularly care for Metal Gear Solid, I can appreciate it for being at least not another goddamn shooter. That's like everything else. And I mean, did the guys who make Battleborn go home and think, how proud they are of making it? I mean, maybe they do. I mean, it's gorgeous, but I don't know. It just feels so been there, done that.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I know you mentioned like you're not at all interested in, any of the current consoles, or you said you don't really feel the need to buy one, but...
Yeah, I am interested. I'm interested because I like games, and I'm interested, but I don't feel the compulsion to...
Yeah, that's why I was trying to make the distinction, but like, I'm curious. I know you are a little bit older than me, but I was wondering, like, for you growing up, and this is something I haven't really gotten a chance to talk too much about, but like, like when Super Nintendo or whatever rolled around, or the next system after that, like, did you grow up having the expectation, like you expected Nintendo or Sony or whoever to like keep making in-house like the same series, to sort of like keep continuing them repeatedly? Like, we're at a point where on the current Nintendo or even the Nintendo handheld, where there's like 3-4 Mario games, or like I asked my friend last week, like, what are the good PS4 games?
Right.
And one of the ones he recommended was like, actually, like, the new Wolfenstein is really awesome. Mm-hmm. And I personally never really thought, like, in the year 2015, someone would tell me, like, yeah, check out the new Wolfenstein. I mean, did you have that feeling, like, in the 90s or whatever, like, that there was that expectation that, like, things just keep sticking to the same series? Or...
Well, you have to remember, in the 90s, I mean, if you date Super Mario Brothers at around 86 for the U.S.
Right. Oh, that's true. They did have 3.
There just wasn't the same. The legacy wasn't the same. So
yeah, I mean, but each of those was like pretty different from one another.
That's true, and also each one was kind of a leap past what the previous one had done, just in terms of content. I mean, 2 was a weird one, but it was a way more... You could play multiple characters and all this stuff. I mean, it was way more in-depth than the original. Mm-hmm. And then the third one just had so much to do and so many secrets, and it felt like you were getting not just something iterative, but something that was really building on the previous installment and then significantly adding to it. I mean, as much as I liked video games growing up, I don't think it was still a niche hobby, and I don't remember gaming necessarily occupying the same mind space that it does now.
That it does now.
Yeah. There just wasn't the same amount of choice, and I was in college when the Super Nintendo was at its heyday, and we barely played it in college, because I guess we had better things to do, like smoke weed and get laid or whatever. But don't print that. But I just didn't have the same level of interest. But I think I thought of Zelda and Metroid and Mario as kind of the stable of Nintendo brands that they would always capitalize on. And then they were very good, and even to this day, despite the fact that they rehash things constantly, even to this day they still try Splatoon, and they try things that are outside those tent poles that they have. So, you didn't get Donkey Kong again, you got Donkey Kong Country. You didn't get exactly Super Mario, you got Yoshi's Island. And they managed to kind of, if not completely break the mold each time, they managed to still feel like they were bringing something fresh to the table. I look back at Halo, I guess it's Halo 1, 2, and 3. Oh, there's people trying to call me. I told them I was busy. What was I saying? You look back at like Halo 1, 2, and 3, or you look back at Call of Duties. I haven't played all the Call of Duties. And you can't remember which one was from which game. I mean, they all just are sort of blend together. I mean, I'm sure super fans can remember specific things, but in general. Yeah. That's more indicative of what I'm talking about in terms of the kind of familiarity of stuff. I mean, I remember when BioShock came out, and it felt like it was a fresh approach to what is really a not very interesting shooter. It just had such amazing atmosphere and story and ambiance that it just felt like a new experience. And I missed that. I think The Last of Us kind of had that. So it's not completely gone. The future is not bleak. It's just the bottom is going to fall out eventually, I think. Do you want to do the introduction part?
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Don't worry, this has happened before. So all we need to quote unquote get started is, can you give me your full name? You don't have to include your middle name unless you really want to. Your full name, your age, where in the world you're located, and just tell me a little bit about your experience in the video game industry.
Okay, in video games. All right. So I'm Matthew Schwartz. I am 42 years old. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And I am currently consulting with Cox Communications on a product called Flare, which is an over-the-top gaming solution similar to a Fire TV or an Ouya, I guess. It's an Android-based micro console that you hook up to your television, and you can stream last-gen PC titles and download Android-based mobile titles, and it's a product targeting kids and families. So I'm currently working on that, providing content strategy and programming strategy for sort of the catalog and how we position, the library for various audiences. It's aimed at kids 4 to 11, basically, and families. Prior to that, I was a producer with Adult Swim Games. I worked mostly on web games, like the original Westeroto that was first a Flash game. I worked on the Rick and Morty Rush licensed adventure game, and a number of other browser games. And then I also produced I produced all of the first slate of Adult Swim games that came to Steam, Super House of Dead Ninjas and Volgar, Jazzpunk, a whole slew of those. Before I was at Adult Swim, I was at Cartoon Network, but I was the content designer on Cartoon Network's MMO called Fusion Fall, doing a lot of quest design. That was very much straight up game development. We were partnered with a developer in Seoul, South Korea, and we also had a team here, obviously, in the States. And I did a lot of the quest design, writing, content creation, working very closely with the lead designer in terms of kind of categorizing and naming weapons and character types. And it's been a while now, so I don't remember all the details, but
okay.
it was an amazing experience in terms of learning the ins and outs of game design, game systems, how all these things sort of work together. Prior to that, I was working on the GameTap project, which was a sort of ahead of its time, all-you-can-eat gaming service that provided a lot of classic games from Atari 2600, Sega Genesis, no Nintendo platforms, but it was kind of a precursor to what you could call the virtual console on Nintendo. I mean, we were running emulated versions of classic games, including arcade games, and it later began to include PC titles, current PC titles of the time. And it was a subscription-based service, and I worked on that actually in its infancy, like when it was first starting out, for a couple of years, and I jumped from there to go work on Fusion Fall. But so I've been in and around games, and before I was on GameTap, I was working on the Cartoon Network website where we were making a lot of Flash games, as many as like one new Flash game a week, I think, at one time. So much web traffic was being generated by those early Flash games, which were, by the way, in many cases inspired by Atari 2600 and arcade games of old. You know, obviously with different looks, but
right,
were very much single screen arcadey style games. So I did not study game design. That was not even an option when I was in college. I didn't really ever think about games as a profession. But when I was at Cartoon Network Digital, the knowledge of all of these old games really came in very handy when we were working with the various vendors that were making our games for us. You know, they might pitch something that sounded a lot like Circus Atari, or something that sounded a lot like Space Invaders or whatever, and we were just having fun putting spins on some of these tried and true formulas. And I mean, Cartoon Network had a lot of success with that in the early days, and to an extent you see that on the App Store too. A lot of the casual gaming, PopCap had its early success doing a lot of stuff that really came from classic arcade mechanics. So anyway, I didn't study game design, but found my way to it.
Well, so I'll sandwich this all around. It'll all make sense, but so. We were just talking a little bit about like how the big budget space is feeling creatively a little stagnant. Tell me a little bit about like why you think independent developers is where you will find the most creativity. Well,
I think that's going to be true in any medium. the guys who are doing something because they feel passionate about it are always going to bring something, I think, more interesting to the table than. And I'm not saying that the AAA developers are only in it for the buck, but it's a bigger part of the equation. Especially if you're dealing with a dev team of 2 or 3 guys, or sometimes it's just one guy. They're being driven by the desire to make that particular game. And and that's true. Like in movies, you have people with a vision for a film, and they make it for $500,000 or whatever, and get it done by hook or by crook, whatever. And I think that's just the nature of it. A lot of those folks are generally going to be younger. They might be fresh out of school, or well, I shouldn't generalize that, because there are a lot of people in independent development who were AAA developers and got tired of the sort of meat grinder of that and wanted to get back to doing something that they could feel passionate about. So maybe I shouldn't generalize there, but I think it's simply a matter of in the independent sphere, you just find people who are where money is a secondary concern. Not that they don't want to make money, because everybody would like to make money, but it's not their driving motivation. And you also get I think a pure expression out of that. The cynicism and kind of the battle-bornness of things doesn't really happen as frequently in those spheres, right? Because the cynicism just hasn't happened yet. And in the case of young graduates, they're just too young to be cynical yet. I mean, I like working with younger people too, who are still not necessarily Pollyanna, but they just have a different outlook than the guy who has worked in the in the trenches with some AAA developer doing animations on a guy's sword, or like some guy who did I met a guy who his only job was to do like the swinging animations for the batters in some baseball game, and all he did was animate every single, and I was just like, dude, that sounds like not only does that sound like not fun, that sounds like actually a circle of hell. Like trying to make a swing animation look different for all
Dante's
of these different
batting cage
players. It just sounds horrible to me. Yeah.
So
right. And the 8th circle shall be in betweening. Yeah, it sounds bad. So I think.
Yeah.
There is an aspect of cynicism that leaks into those kind of people.
Yeah. Well, so just talking a little bit about the indie scene, like it something I've been curious, I've never really heard someone else talk about with me, is a little bit about like the whole lineage of how it has gone from being like a homebrew scene to when they were just nebulously referred to as devs to now this iteration where they're indie, but it's largely, the same group of people. I'm curious, like, what sort of changes you've observed, even though I know you said, like, you weren't always obsessively watching what's been going on in games, but, like, beyond the last few years, how have you seen that sector change? Or what
I will tell you honestly, I think the biggest shift was in academics. I think once schools began to offer game design classes and coding classes with a very gaming focus, or 3D modeling. It came out of the realm of art schools and out of the realm of pure technical schools and into this sort of Georgia Tech, which is near here, has I think they call it computational sciences.
Yeah.
Which is a fancy way of saying computer science as applied to essentially the arts or to other things. Director, Macromedia, which was, I think, still Macromind Director, when I was in college, eventually morphed into Flash. And, once you could start taking classes in Flash animation in the late 90s and learn ActionScript and other kinds of code, to where it is now, where people can actually major in game design. I think that's what changed the indie dev community, because you now have young people coming out of schools with all of this knowledge, and they may or may not want or get a job at a big developer, and they obviously have interest in. I mean, unless they were forced to do it by maybe Will. Hey.
Hello?
Hi.
Okay, cool. We're here. Sorry. Can you say your hilarious thing about Will Wright again?
Oh, it wasn't that hilarious. I don't know if I'm going to say it again. But your question was...
Well, you were talking about just the rise of people coming into it much younger because of education.
Right. I mean, basically you have today, and it wasn't always the case, that you can get your undergraduate degree at a in some cases a liberal arts college and find classes in game design, or find classes in systems design, or go to a film school where you learn 3D modeling, or an art school where you do texture work or what have you. All of those things kind of existed before, but the technology didn't exist in the early 90s, and it's only emerged over the last 15 or 20 years or so. So now you have students coming out with all of this knowledge of game design. There were no books on game design when Pac-Man was in the arcades. A lot of the guys that did the early MMOs and stuff, they were designed like tabletop RPGs, because that's where those guys were doing their game design before. So you now have a whole generation of game designers who have learned game design based on Miyamoto and Will Wright and all. They're studying the way PS2 games are old.
So yeah, or like yeah. So when you were working,
right, but that's a huge shift, is what I'm saying.
No, yeah, I was gonna.
Those are the kids that are coming out of school, and if they don't go to what I was saying, I think that got cut off, is that they get out of school and they may have aspirations to work at a big developer, and they don't get a job, or they do, or they don't have those aspirations. They want to. There's a game that they've been dying to make, and they get out of school with 3 or 4 of their fellow students who have the same vision, and they get together and they make a game because they want to. Game jams are a new phenomenon, because there's all these students there with the time and the energy and the passion to experiment and try these things. And I think that's what fuels that is what has fueled the explosion in independent development.
Do you think there's an aspect to some of that group of developers that is seeking to keep aspects of games narrow? I mean, we talked a lot about the big budget space, the reasons they keep things narrow, but do you feel they're the only force in that frontier?
Well, I think just by its nature in the independent sphere, you just see more variety, because, as I said about the high cost of AAA development, they're just in a position that they can take more risk. So you'll see more personal games that have a more personal story in them, or games that, but at the same time, the argument can be made that they're as derivative as everything else. They're just derivative on a different scale. They're derivative in pixel art instead of in 1,000 polygons. It is distressing that a small team of indie guys would get out there and go, we're going to make a first-person shooter like no one's ever seen. You will occasionally see some interesting things in tried and true genres that are usually in the realm of the AAA sphere, but by and large, those things I think are most effectively separate for a reason. And you see a lot of pixel art, not because independent developers love pixel art. It's because sprites and sprite animation and pixel art is sort of easier to generate on a scale when you only have one or two artists, maybe. There's more 2D gaming in independent development because that's just simply easier to manage at the scale that they're operating at. But yeah, it's for as much ingenuity as you see, there's yet another retro 2D puzzle platformer that comes out virtually every day on Steam. So go back to the days of yesteryear with Pixel Pete or whatever, and not to knock Pixel Pete, great, everyone loves Pixel Pete, but if you are operating in that realm where you don't have the same limitations, at least me speaking as the player now, I'm much more interested in look at Goat Simulator or I'm blanking on it now. The DDR one in the dungeon. The Necromancer.
Yeah.
Crypt of the Necromancer, right? Those guys are just trying out crazy things, and being successful at it, and getting a response from the audience. It's just that audience isn't really growing. If anything, it may be shrinking. We can talk about that too. But I didn't go to PAX this year, but I went last year, and there was a 2-person dev team that made a sled dog game. I wouldn't call it a sled dog simulator, but you basically were a guy that managed a team of sled dogs, and you had to. And I was just captivated by it because I've never seen a sled dog game. I thought it was really interesting, and you had to keep the sled dogs happy so that you would move at optimal speed from point A to point B, and the pixel art was really pretty, and I don't know. Can you imagine, like EA, we can make another first-person shooter, or we could make this amazing sled dog simulator? I mean, it just would never happen. Never.
I mean, a couple decades ago, maybe in the 80s, but today, no.
Right. Back in the heady days of 1984. Well, I guess 1984 wouldn't have been more like 1982.
Well,
when all the guys, all the Atari guys were in their hot tub smoking a doobie, going, "What if we made a sled dog simulator?" Dude, get what's his name to do it? Warshaw, where are you? You like sled dogs, right?